Take a deep breath and gently close your eyes. Let your mind wander. Let it embark on a journey to distant lands shrouded in the mists of time. Listen to the story of the people who lived on the northern shores of Europe, on lands battered by the sea's fierce waves, where the wind carried the scent of salt. As the power of the Roman Empire slowly waned, the Germanic tribes began to grow stronger. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. These three names represented the peoples who would radically change the destiny of England in the future. They lived in the depths of dense forests, around mist-covered lakes, and on quiet shores where fishing boats docked. They were known for their mastery of seafaring, their warrior nature, and their lifestyle intertwined with nature. With the withdrawal of the Roman Empire from Britain, around 410 AD, the island was plunged into a great power vacuum. The native Britons struggled to cope with both their internal conflicts and the attacks of the Pict and Scottish tribes from the north. This weakness presented an opportunity for the Anglo-Saxons. Rich and fertile lands, the hope for a better life, and the desire for a new beginning drew them to England. Now, imagine a ship, its full sails billowing in the wind, propelled by northern winds toward the unknown. These ships carried not only people, but also a culture, a language, and a faith. With such hope and courage, the Anglo-Saxons embarked on a long and arduous journey to England, towards the unknown, but also towards a new page in history. Anglo-Saxon society was like the branches of a tree with deep roots. At the top were the aristocratic leaders who bravely commanded their tribes in battle. These leaders defended their lands, protected their people, and represented the honor of their tribes. Below them were freemen, churls. They farmed, worked their own land, and took up arms when necessary. At the bottom of society were slaves, thralls, people with no rights, usually consisting of prisoners of war or those unable to pay their debts. The family was at the center of Anglo-Saxon life. Extended families worked their lands together, sharing production and security. Women also played an important role in society. They worked in agriculture as well as doing household chores, and some could even own property. This balance was like an invisible web that ensured the continuity of society. And of course, their world was filled with gods. Woden was the mighty god of the sky and war. Thor was the symbol of thunder and power. Frigg was the compassionate goddess of fertility and love. Ty, or Tyr, was the symbol of justice and courage. Each represented a different aspect of life. People offered sacrifices to them, lit fires, and prayed. Although these beliefs would eventually be replaced by Christianity, they would leave their mark deep within Anglo-Saxon culture. The Anglo-Saxon migration was not merely a population movement. It was a transformation in which a people carried their identity, language, traditions, and beliefs to an island. The moment they set foot in England, they changed the island's history, culture, and language forever. And now, before you fall asleep, you are at the very beginning of this epic tale. Listen to the sound of the wind echoing through the depths of time. This is the voice of the Anglo-Saxons, the voice of determination, courage, and rebirth. Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Let your mind wander freely and drift away to that historic journey the Saxons made to the southern shores of England. Listen to the waves crashing against the shore, Hear the cries of the seagulls and feel the atmosphere of that era within you. The British Isles were left unprotected after the withdrawal of the Roman Empire. The native population was struggling with its own internal conflicts and also finding it difficult to cope with threats from the north. This weakness presented an unmissable opportunity for the Saxon sailors. With their long and sturdy ships, they set sail for the southern shores of England. When the Saxons first arrived in England, they were impressed by the fertile land and sheltered bays along the southern coast. This region was an ideal place for them to settle. They could protect themselves from attacks from the sea and also make a living by farming. The Saxons' mastery of shipbuilding played a major role in their success. Their ships were long, narrow vessels called longships. These ships could be propelled by both oars and sails. They could navigate easily even in shallow waters, making them ideal for raiding areas close to the coast. Oak, a durable wood, was used in the construction of longships. The hull of the ship was built with overlapping wooden planks. This made the ship both light and sturdy. There was a single mast in the middle of the ship, to which a rectangular sail was attached. On the sides of the ship were seats for the oarsmen. Saxon ships were used not only for war and plunder, but also for trade and exploration. Thanks to these ships, the Saxons were able to connect with other parts of England and even the European continent. The first Saxon settlements were usually small villages. These villages were established in areas close to the coastline. The houses were made of wood and reeds and were surrounded by ditches and walls. The people living in the villages were engaged in farming, fishing, and handicrafts. They worked the land, grazed their animals, and fed themselves with what they obtained from the sea. When the Saxons arrived in England, they encountered the island's indigenous people. This encounter led to long and bloody wars. However, thanks to their warrior nature and mastery of seafaring, the Saxons managed to seize a large part of the southern coast. Gradually, they began to establish their own kingdoms in this region. Kingdoms such as Sussex, Essex, and Wessex were the most important evidence of the Saxons' presence in England. Over time, the Saxon settlements on the southern coast grew and developed. New villages were established, cities were built, and trade flourished. The Saxons were building a new civilization in England. They were bringing their own language, culture, and traditions to the island. And now you are witnessing one of the most important moments in this epic story. Take a deep breath and relax. Imagine the life of the Saxons on the southern coast, the sight of their ships gliding across the sea.
Close your eyes and clear your mind for a moment. I now invite you to the epic tale of the kingdoms rising on the soil of England. We embark on a journey into an era shaped by the shadow of war, woven with alliances, and enriched by cultural change. After the Anglo-Saxons set foot in England, they began to declare their sovereignty across the island. Over time, these small settlements grew, gained strength, and transformed into kingdoms fiercely competing with one another. In this relentless competitive environment, some kingdoms rose above others and changed the course of history. Rising from the lands swept by the cold winds of the north, Northumbria was the most powerful star in the Anglo-Saxon world during the 7th and 8th centuries. Under the wise rule of King Edwin and the resolute leadership of King Oswald, this kingdom experienced its golden age. Edwin introduced Northumbria to a new faith by accepting Christianity, initiating a cultural transformation. Oswald, meanwhile, made great efforts to spread Christianity and established his kingdom as a center of learning by founding Lindisfarne Monastery. Northumbria was known not only for its military successes, but also for its monasteries, such as Lindisfarne and Jarrow, which were among Europe's most important educational centers. In these monasteries, manuscripts were prepared, ancient works were translated, and scientific research was conducted, all of which would be passed down for centuries. Northumbria's social life also benefited from this cultural richness. The people practiced both pagan traditions and Christian beliefs. Mercia, established in the fertile lands of central England, competed with Northumbria for many years. However, in the 8th century, Mercia, under King Offa, seized the title of England's most powerful kingdom. Offa expanded his kingdom's borders, built castles at strategic points, and constructed a massive wall, Offa's Dyke, named after himself, to protect the Welsh border. Offa's reign was a turning point for Mercia. He strengthened his kingdom's military power by building a strong army, revitalized its economy by promoting trade, and declared economic independence by minting his own currency. He also enriched Mercia's religious and cultural life by supporting churches and monasteries. Mercia's social life was based on agriculture and trade. The vast majority of the population lived in villages and worked the land for a living. Wessex, rising in the mild climate of the south, made its mark on history with its heroic resistance against the Viking raids. In the 9th century, under the leadership of King Alfred the Great, Wessex became England's beacon of hope against the Vikings. Alfred defeated the Viking armies, reclaimed the Danelaw region, and took important steps towards the unification of England. Alfred was not only a warrior, but also a wise statesman and an enlightened thinker. He established justice by reorganizing the legal system, raised the level of refinement in society by promoting education, and ensured that English history was passed down to future generations by commissioning the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Wessex's social life was characterized by a warrior society structure. The people had to constantly fight against Viking raids. This situation led to values such as discipline, courage, and resilience coming to the fore in Wessex society. Kent, founded on the land where the first Anglo-Saxons settled in England, was the first center of Christianity in England. In the late 6th century, Christian missionaries led by St. Augustine arrived in Kent and converted King Ethelbert to Christianity. By accepting Christianity, Ethelbert radically changed the religious structure of his kingdom and made Canterbury the heart of Christianity in England. Kent spearheaded the spread of Christianity in England and left a deep mark on the island's religious and cultural future. Kent's social life was shaped under the influence of Christianity. The church played an important role in every area of society. These 4 kingdoms were the most important forces that determined the fate of Anglo-Saxon England. Their endless rivalry, bloody wars, and complex alliances were recorded in the pages of English history. And now you bear witness to the heroism and betrayal of that epic era. Rest your eyes and let your mind embark on a journey through these ancient lands.
Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Free your mind and let it embark on a journey toward the battle cries echoing across the lands of England. We are traveling to a period where you will witness the relentless struggle between the Anglo-Saxons and the native Britons. When the Anglo-Saxons set foot in England, they encountered the Britons, the island's native people. This encounter led to long and bloody wars. The Anglo-Saxons had come to England in groups and established small kingdoms in the areas where they settled. The Britons, on the other hand, lived in a more scattered manner and lacked unity among themselves. The wars usually took the form of small-scale clashes. The Anglo-Saxons raided and plundered Briton villages and seized their lands. The Britons, on the other hand, resisted the Anglo-Saxons using guerrilla tactics. The Britons, who knew the wooded areas and rugged terrain well, tried to surprise the Anglo-Saxons by launching sudden attacks. The Anglo-Saxons generally used swords, spears, and shields in battle. Bows and arrows were also widely used. Anglo-Saxon warriors were generally experienced and well-trained. Among their battle tactics, the shield wall played an important role. In this tactic, warriors lined up side by side, joined their shields together, and formed an impenetrable wall against the enemy. Spears and swords were used from behind this wall. The Britons, on the other hand, used lighter weapons than the Anglo-Saxons. Spears, shields, and short swords were the basic equipment of Briton warriors. The Britons placed a greater emphasis on mobility in battle. They attempted to wear down the enemy by launching sudden raids. However, they were unable to develop an effective strategy against the Anglo-Saxon shield wall. The future of the wars developed in favor of the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons fought in a more organized manner and possessed advanced battle tactics. They were also able to receive constant reinforcements from the sea. The Britons, on the other hand, were unable to unite due to internal disagreements and were constantly losing territory. The Anglo-Saxon ships also played an important role in their success in battle. The ships quickly transported warriors from one area to another and provided logistical support. However, the Britons' resistance did not end completely. Some Briton tribes managed to preserve their independence by retreating westward to regions such as Wales and Cornwall. King Arthur, the subject of legends, became a symbol of the Briton struggle against the Anglo-Saxons. Arthur and his knights fought heroically against the Anglo-Saxons and kept the Britons' hopes alive. The process of war and conquest also changed the demographic structure of England. The Anglo-Saxons conquered England, established their own kingdoms, and laid the foundations of English culture. And now you are witnessing the brutal realities of that epic era. Rest your eyes and take your mind on a journey through these ancient lands.
Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Free your mind and let it embark on a journey toward the sound of bells echoing across England. We are going back to a time when you will witness how Christianity spread among the Anglo-Saxons and its cultural impact. When the Anglo-Saxons arrived in England, they held pagan beliefs. However, over time, Christianity began to spread among the Anglo-Saxons. Missionaries played an important role in this spread. Missionaries sent from Rome, in particular, came to England and introduced Christianity to the Anglo-Saxon kings. Missionaries led by St. Augustine came to Kent, converted King Ethelbert to Christianity, and made Canterbury the center of Christianity in England. The conversion of kings was an important turning point in the spread of Christianity. For example, King Ethelbert of Kent's acceptance of Christianity accelerated its spread throughout England. After converting, kings encouraged their people to convert to Christianity as well. The conversion of kings often led to the destruction of pagan temples and the construction of churches. Christianity led to significant cultural changes in Anglo-Saxon society. For example, Christianity encouraged education and learning. Monasteries became centers of education, and Anglo-Saxon children were taught to read and write. Christianity also influenced art and architecture. Churches were built as magnificent structures, and Christian art became part of Anglo-Saxon culture. Manuscripts were decorated with scenes from the Bible, and churches were adorned with sculptures and paintings. The spread of Christianity also contributed to the unification of England. Christianity created a common identity that brought together different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Thanks to Christianity, kings established better relations with each other and took important steps toward the unification of England. Christian clergy acted as mediators between kings and helped resolve disputes. However, the spread of Christianity was not easy. Some Anglo-Saxons, who were strongly attached to their pagan beliefs, resisted Christianity. Missionaries made great efforts to overcome this resistance. Over time, Christianity took root in Anglo-Saxon society and became an important part of English culture. Christianity became not only a religious belief, but also a way of life. Christianity also profoundly affected the Anglo-Saxons' daily lives. For example, Christianity changed the Anglo-Saxons' moral values. Christianity emphasized values such as love, compassion, and tolerance. Furthermore, Christianity changed the Anglo-Saxons' perception of time. Christianity taught that time was a gift from God and that every moment should be spent serving God. The Anglo-Saxons now spent their time praying in church, reading the Bible, and doing charitable work. This religious transformation played a significant role in shaping English history. Christianity gave the Anglo-Saxon society new values, a new worldview, and a new identity. And now you are following in the footsteps of that epic transformation. Rest your eyes and take your mind on a journey through these ancient lands.
Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Let your mind wander and embark on a pre-sleep journey through history toward the rise of the Kingdom of Wessex. Listen to the story of Wessex, which was gaining increasing influence over other kingdoms in England. In Anglo-Saxon England, the Kingdom of Wessex gradually began to stand out among the other kingdoms. Its geographical location, strong leaders, and strategic alliances played an important role in this rise. Located in the south, Wessex was less affected by Viking raids than other kingdoms. This helped Wessex maintain its economic and military strength. The kings also played a major role in Wessex's rise. In particular, King Egbert and King Alfred the Great made Wessex one of the most powerful kingdoms in England. Egbert expanded Wessex's borders by establishing dominance over other kingdoms. Alfred, on the other hand, went down in history for his heroic resistance against the Vikings. Alfred the Great was not only a warrior, but a wise statesman. In addition to his wars against the Vikings, he made important reforms in the fields of education, law, and culture. Alfred's reforms were of great importance for the future of Wessex and England. Alfred took important steps primarily in the field of education. He contributed to the development of the English language by translating many works from Latin into English. He also opened schools to increase the number of people who could read and write. Alfred believed that education was essential for the progress of society. Alfred also implemented reforms in the field of law, attempting to create a fairer system by bringing Anglo-Saxon law together. Believing in the rule of law, Alfred believed that everyone was equal before the law. Alfred also made important innovations in the military field. He modernized his army, making it more effective against the Vikings. He also strengthened the defense of Wessex by building castles. Alfred believed that military power was indispensable for the protection of the kingdom. Under Alfred's leadership, Wessex grew stronger not only militarily, but also culturally. Significant developments took place in the arts and literature. Alfred made great efforts to preserve and spread Anglo-Saxon culture. The rise of Wessex had a significant impact on other kingdoms. Wessex encouraged other kingdoms to unite against the Vikings and initiated the process of unifying England. Under Alfred's leadership, other kingdoms began to recognize Wessex's supremacy. This paved the way for England to unite under a single kingdom. In this pre-sleep journey through history, you witnessed the rise of Wessex and Alfred's reforms. Rest your eyes and fill your mind with the story of this ancient kingdom.
Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Now we embark on a pre-sleep journey through history, back to those dark days when ships from the north approached the shores of England. Listen to how England was shaken by the arrival of the great Viking army. In 865, an event occurred that would fundamentally change the history of England, the arrival of the great Viking army. This army consisted of warriors gathered from all corners of Scandinavia, primarily Denmark. Various reasons lay behind these orders targeting of England from distant lands: the desire for fertile lands, dreams of enrichment through plunder, and the desire to establish new homelands. The Great Viking Army was the largest and most organized Viking force to set foot on English soil up to that point. At its helm were ruthless leaders such as Ivar Ragnarsson and Halfdan Ragnarsson, whose names are celebrated in Viking sagas. The Vikings were not only traditional warriors, but also masters of navigation. Thanks to their long, narrow boats, they could easily navigate rivers, launch sudden raids along the coastline, and overcome advanced enemy defenses. The arrival of the great Viking army was a complete disaster for England. Starting with Northumbria, the Vikings conquered one wealthy kingdom after another, including East Anglia and Mercia. They plundered monasteries and stole sacred relics, burned villages and slaughtered the people, and ruthlessly enslaved those who resisted. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were unable to withstand the Viking raids and helplessly lost territory. However, just when all hope seemed lost, the Kingdom of Wessex stood firm against the Vikings and became England's last hope. King Alfred the Great inspired his people by launching a resistance against the Vikings and fought with determination. He strengthened Wessex's defenses by developing war strategies, building a new army, and constructing castles. Thanks to Alfred's determination and leadership, Wessex managed to resist the Viking attacks and became a turning point for England's future. In this pre-sleep journey through history, you witness the terrifying advance of the great Viking army and Wessex's epic resistance. Rest your eyes and fill your mind with the excitement of this age-old saga. When Alfred ascended the throne of Wessex, his kingdom was under relentless Viking threat. The great Viking army had seized a large portion of England's territory, subjugated many kingdoms from Northumbria to Wessex, and plunged the people into despair. Instead of giving up under these difficult circumstances, the young King Alfred rallied his people and launched a relentless resistance against the Vikings. Alfred's struggle against the Vikings was a testing process. In the early stages of the war, the Wessex army suffered defeats against the superior military power of the Vikings. However, Alfred learned from these defeats, modernized his army, improved his tactics, and managed to keep his people's morale high. Alfred developed war strategies, trying to identify the Vikings' weak points, and structured his army accordingly. In the spring of 878, an event that would change the course of English history took place, the Battle of Edington. Alfred assembled his army experimentally and launched a surprise attack against the Vikings. The battle resulted in heavy losses for both sides, but thanks to Alfred's military genius and the courage of his soldiers, the Wessex army emerged victorious. Among Alfred's battle tactics, attacking when the Vikings least expected it, turning the terrain to his advantage, and using a disciplined army played a significant role. The Battle of Edington not only halted the Vikings' advance into England, but also marked a new era between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. Thanks to his victory, Alfred managed to negotiate a settlement with the Vikings. Under the terms of the agreement, the Vikings would withdraw from Wessex territory and remain in the areas they had captured. Although this agreement resulted in England being divided in two, it created an opportunity for the survival and preservation of Wessex and English culture. After the Battle of Edington, Alfred set to work rebuilding Wessex and bringing prosperity to his people. He implemented a series of reforms in education, law, military, and culture, transforming Wessex into a stronger and more prosperous kingdom. Alfred established schools to increase literacy rates, systematized the law to ensure justice, built castles to strengthen the kingdom's defenses, and supported Anglo-Saxon culture to foster a national identity. Alfred is known as the Great for his role in saving England from the Vikings and preserving English identity. His leadership, strategic intelligence, and reforms constitute one of the brightest pages of English history. Alfred's resistance in the Battle of Edington are considered one of the most important events in English history. This event determined England's future and has become an exemplary act of heroism in the hearts of the English people.
The treaty signed after the Battle of Edington opened a new chapter in English history. The eastern and northern regions of the island were now marked on the map as the Danelaw, an area where Viking laws prevailed. Although difficult for the Anglo-Saxons to accept, this was the only way to secure peace for a time. Danelaw covered the areas that are now Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, Derbyshire, Cambridgeshire, Suffolk, and Norfolk. Viking culture and traditions prevailed in these lands. The Vikings had established their own system of government and had begun to integrate with the local population. Danelaw was governed by administrators known as lawmen, who were traditional Vikings. These administrators enforced both local customs and Viking laws. The most important cities in Danelaw included York, also known as Jorvik, Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, and Leicester. These cities became centers of trade and cultural interaction. York, in particular, was one of the most important Viking trading centers. Merchants from Scandinavia, Europe, and even the Middle East gathered in the city. The Vikings used their seafaring experience to revitalize trade and create new markets. Furs, slaves, silver, and various handicrafts were among the most important trade items in the Danelaw. The Anglo-Saxons living in the Danelaw had to comply with Viking laws. However, they continued to maintain their own traditions and beliefs. Over time, Viking and Anglo-Saxon cultures began to influence each other. Changes occurred in language, art, and even religious beliefs. Many Scandinavian-derived words, such as law, window, and knife, entered the English language. In art, Viking stylized animal motifs were blended with Anglo-Saxon designs. Alfred and his successors fought continuously to reclaim the Danelaw. However, the Vikings also fought resolutely to defend their lands. The struggle between the two sides lasted for years and profoundly affected English history. The Danelaw is one of the origins of England's multicultural structure. Examining the Danelaw to understand the Vikings' influence on England and their complex relationship with the Anglo-Saxons is like embarking on a journey through time.
When Alfred passed away in 899, he left behind a powerful kingdom and a lasting legacy. His death marked a turning point in English history, giving rise to new hope for the future of the Anglo-Saxons. Alfred's legacy was not limited to military victories. He was also a wise ruler, educator, and man of culture. One of Alfred's most important legacies was his work to preserve the English language and culture. He contributed to the development of the English language by translating many works from Latin into English. Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy and Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care were among the most important works Alfred translated. These translations not only spread knowledge, but also helped enrich and standardize the English language. He also opened schools to increase the number of literate people. His efforts played an important role in the formation of English identity and greatly contributed to the development of English literature. His order to write the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was also an invaluable step in passing on English history to future generations. Alfred was a leader who believed in the rule of law. He tried to create a fairer system by bringing Anglo-Saxon law together. His efforts laid the foundation for the English legal system and created the origins of common law, which would influence centuries to come. Alfred's legal reforms aimed to ensure justice in society and prevent the powerful from oppressing the weak. He codified the laws, making them accessible to everyone, and tried to prevent judges from acting arbitrarily when making decisions. Alfred's military reforms were also of great importance. He modernized his army to make it more effective against the Vikings. He strengthened the militia force known as the Fyrd and established a standing army. He also strengthened the kingdom's defenses by building castles. These castles, called burhs, became not only defensive structures but also centers of trade and settlement. This provided protection against Viking attacks while also stimulating economic activity. His reforms played a critical role in England's resistance against the Vikings and prevented the country's division. Alfred's legacy lived on after his death. His successors continued his policies and took important steps towards uniting England. His son Edward and daughter Athelflaed continued the fight against the Vikings and reclaimed much of the Danelaw.
Alfred is remembered as one of the greatest heroes in English history, and his leadership continues to be a source of inspiration for the English people. His sense of justice, love of education, and patriotism are considered values that will be cherished in English society for centuries to come. Rest your eyes and imagine a united England, built upon the strong foundation left by Alfred. Alfred had defended his kingdom, but the task of completing this grand vision of unification would fall to his grandson, Athelstan. After Alfred's death, Athelstan would unite the lands gradually won against the Vikings by his son Edward and daughter Athelflaed under a single banner. This success would be made possible not only by military genius, but also by decisive and intelligent leadership. When Athelstan ascended to the throne in 925, much of England was still divided into two powerful regions, Mercia and Wessex, while Viking rule persisted in the north. Athelstan was not only a warrior in the European realm of his time, but also a respected diplomat on the international stage. He forged alliances with European kings and extended Wessex's influence beyond the British Isles by marrying his sisters to the continent's leading nobles. These marriages consolidated the power and legitimacy of his kingdom throughout Europe, providing him with a diplomatic shield against Viking threats. His grand ambition was to unite all of England under a single crown. He set out to be the first person in history to realize this vision. In 927, he took a giant step toward this goal by conquering York, formerly known as Jorvik, one of the most important Viking centers in England. With this conquest, Athelstan declared himself not only King of Wessex, but also Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain. This title was the first official claim of the modern kingship of England and represented his ambition to be ruler of the entire island. He enacted laws in his realm with iron will. These laws, while continuing Alfred's legal tradition, aimed to ensure justice and order throughout the kingdom. The king's edicts laid the foundations for orderly governance and a strong central authority. However, Athelstan's great unification and rise did not go unnoticed by the island's other powerful actors. The Scots, Britons, and the Viking kingdoms of the Irish Sea, unnerved by Athelstan's growing power, formed a massive coalition to make their final stand. This coalition posed a total threat to English unity. In 937, this conflict, known in history as the Battle of Brunanburg, took place. Brunanburg was one of the bloodiest and most decisive battles of medieval England. Athelstan won this battle with a crushing victory, the glorious repercussions of which were recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. With this defeat, the Vikings were largely driven from British lands, and the power of the Scots-Briton alliance was broken. This victory cemented the fact that England was now a single kingdom and sealed the island's future. With this kingdom, Athelstan laid the lasting foundation for English identity and statehood. He was not only a king, but also the founder of a nation. Following his victory, he elevated England's stature in international affairs, exchanging gifts with kings across Europe and making his court a center of learning. His reign ushered in a period of hope after a period of difficult wars. Athelstan's vision was that peace and order could be established not only by the sword, but also by diplomacy and law. This strong foundation would enable the next king to usher in a period of peace. Slowly close your eyes and feel the peace spreading across the lands of England. Following Athelstan's battlefield victories, the kingdom was now united and powerful. Building on this solid legacy, England would experience one of its golden ages during the reign of King Edgar, 959 to 975 AD. This period went down in history as the reign of peace and order. Edgar embraced the goal of preserving the unity that Athelstan had forged through hard struggles and strengthening internal order. For this reason, he was given the title of Edgar the Peaceful, Edgar Pacificus. During his reign, Viking raids almost completely ceased, allowing the kingdom to devote its resources not to warfare, but to development, culture, and administrative structure. This stability and security accelerated the prosperity and cultural development of Anglo-Saxon society. Peace brought with it a cultural and administrative renaissance. Edgar, in particular, strongly supported church reforms. He revitalized monastic life by attracting prominent clergy, most notably the learned Archbishop St. Dunstan. Monasteries once again became centers of art, literature, and education. Ancient Anglo-Saxon manuscripts were rewritten, religious rules were tightened, and England became one of the most educated regions in Europe. These monastic reforms not only revitalized spiritual life, but also helped spread a moral order throughout the kingdom. Educated clergy assumed important positions in the royal administration, strengthening the bureaucracy. Edgar centralized and modernized not only the church, but also the state administration. He established a uniform legal system valid throughout the kingdom, adding new regulations based on Alfred's laws. He also introduced standardized weights and measures. These reforms facilitated trade within the kingdom, encouraged economic activity, and strengthened the administrative structure. The justice system became more effective in the shires and hundreds, the local administrative units. Ensuring the peace of the people was central to his governing philosophy. The pinnacle of Edgar's power was his magnificent coronation in Chester in 973. This ceremony, of unprecedented grandeur, symbolized Edgar's ascendancy over the island of Britain. The presence of not only Anglo-Saxon nobles, but also 6 to 8 petty kings from Wales and Scotland rowing his ship down the river, served as a tangible symbol of his undisputed supremacy over all of Britain. This demonstrated the international power of the English crown. His 16-year reign marked a period in which the idea of England was fully established. The din of war had subsided, lands were cultivated, and hymns were sung in monasteries. However, history is cyclical. This long period of peace always heralded new storms, for a weak administration followed by a strong leader would leave the kingdom vulnerable to external threats. This period of peace was about to end with the looming threat of a new Viking, and England would once again face a great test.
Let your mind drift from the tranquility of peace to the sudden drumbeat of war rising from the horizon. With the death of Edgar the Peaceful, the established order began to crumble rapidly. His son, who ascended to the throne at an early age, emerged as a king bearing perhaps one of the most unfortunate nicknames in English history, Aethelred, also known as the ill-advised, or more accurately, the ill-convised. This epithet summarized his incompetent leadership and the flawed decisions that led his kingdom to disaster. Aethelred's reign, AD 978 to 1016, was a period of decline and chaos for England. The strong central government of Edgar's time weakened, dissension among the nobility increased, and worst of all, the Vikings returned. This new Viking raid was far more systematic than the previous plundering raids. Led by the Norwegian Olaf Tryggvason and the Danish Svein Forkbeard, these Vikings were no longer simply seeking loot, they aimed to conquer England. They were closely monitoring England's internal turmoil and the weakness of the crown.
This time, the threat was far greater and more organized. Aethelred's rule was a complete disaster in the face of this new threat. He made poor decisions, was torn between the conflicting advice of his advisors, and instead of defeating the Vikings by military force, he resorted to a disgraceful measure, the Danegeld, Danish gold. The Danegeld was a large tribute paid to the Vikings in exchange for leaving England alone. Initially a small sum, the Vikings demanded more, and each time Aethelred agreed to pay this exorbitant sum. This led not to a solution, but to further greed. Each payment demonstrated to the Vikings that England was weak and that they could extract more. The crown was financing its enemy with its own hands. These ransoms were financed by heavy taxes levied on Anglo-Saxon farmers and nobles. The people were crushed under both the Viking depredations and the Danegeld taxes exacted by their own king. The kingdom was rapidly disintegrating, and trust in royal authority was eroding. Even the Anglo-Saxon nobility began to act independently of the king to defend their own territories, completely disrupting the country's unity. Aethelred's misrule would reach its darkest point when he made a decision to save himself and his kingdom. Rather than silence the Vikings, this decision would plunge them into an all-out war against England, sealing the king's fate forever. The pressure on the people and the nobility had reached an unbearable point, and this drove Aethelred to a desperate and horrific act. Rest now, for this unfortunate king's terrible decision was preparing for one of the bloodiest days in history and fueling the storm of vengeance from the north.
Close your eyes and picture that cold, terrifying November morning. The year is 1002, and it is November 13, St. Brice's Day. King Ethelred's misrule and the constant tribute paid to the Vikings had exhausted the patience of the Anglo-Saxon people. In panic and under the influence of the wrong counsel, Ethelred issued an unthinkable and brutal order against all Danish settlers in his realm. The order was simple, but its consequences were horrific. All the Danes in England shall be killed on a single day. This order, issued after the Vikings had settled in the Danelaw and lived side by side with the Anglo-Saxons for over a century, was a decision that transcended moral boundaries. Across the country, peaceful settlers, farmers, traders, and even those who had married and raised families with Anglo-Saxons were targeted. This was not a planned military operation, but a mass atrocity committed against civilians, casting a shadow over centuries of Anglo-Saxon civility. That day, bloodshed erupted in many parts of England. Local Anglo-Saxon nobles and common people, obeying their king's orders, massacred their neighbors. In Oxford, the locals threatened Danes seeking refuge in a church to leave, then set fire to the church and killed the refugees. One of the most notable victims of this atrocity was Gunhild and her family, sister of the Viking king Sweyn Forkbeard, who was demanding tribute from England. Gunhild was in England as a peaceful ambassador who had converted to Christianity. Her death was not an ordinary murder, but an insult to the royal family and a pretext for war. The St. Brice's Day massacre was not a desperate attempt by Ethelred to save his kingdom, but a grave mistake that led to his inevitable end and provided the Vikings with the legitimacy they sought. When news of this massacre reached Scandinavia, especially King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, a thirst for vengeance ignited. The murder of his sister and hundreds of innocent Danes became a justification and a sacred duty for Sweyn to conquer England rather than plunder it. This event completely shattered Ethelred's already weak reign. He was now facing not just Vikings demanding tribute, but a powerful and determined king sworn to revenge. England had to prepare for its largest Viking invasion yet, and this time there was no Alfred to stand against them. The people deeply regretted their king's immoral deed, but they also felt the terror of the coming storm in their bones. Now rest and imagine the shadow of that bloody day casting its shadow over the sails of the King of Denmark's vengeful ships.
Close your eyes and listen to the bleak wind of vengeance wafting from across the ocean. The grim echoes of the St. Brice's Day massacre spurred King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark into action. This time, Sweyn was coming not for temporary spoils,
but for the crown of England, for permanent conquest. His army consisted not only of warriors, but also of vengeful kinsmen and settlers seeking land. Sweyn was a ruthless and determined leader living up to his name. He had conquered Norway, united Denmark under a single crown, and instilled fear in Europe. He was perfectly poised to capitalize on the chaos created by Aethelred's incompetence and the massacre. From 1003 onward, Sweyn transformed his annual raids on England into a full-scale campaign of conquest. In these relentless campaigns, which lasted for years, English resistance crumbled piece by piece. Aethelred's armies were disorganized, his nobles betrayed him, they frequently clashed. As King Aethelred attempted to rally his army and resist, his army disintegrated, and faith in his leaders vanished. The money spent on paying the Danegild rather than strengthening the kingdom's defenses merely enriched the enemy. Sweyn used these funds to hire larger fleets and better soldiers. The people were tired of being crushed under both the weight of taxes and the constant raids of the Vikings. By 1013, Sweyn's conquests reached their peak. The Viking fleet landed on the Humber River and rapidly advanced inland. The Danish settlers in the Danelaw naturally saw Sweyn as their savior and supported him. City after city submitted to the Viking king. Aethelred, having lost the support of his people, was left helpless. With his armies disintegrating and most of the nobles swearing allegiance to Sweyn, he was left with only one option: flight. At the end of 1013, King Aethelred of his family were forced to seek refuge in the safe haven of Normandy, with his wife Emma's relatives. By then, almost no one in England remained loyal to him. At the end of 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard was proclaimed King of England. Thus, for the first time in hundreds of years, the kingdom founded by the Anglo-Saxons came under the rule of a foreign power, a Viking king. England was now part of the Danish Empire. This was one of the greatest humiliations the Anglo-Saxons had ever faced. However, Sweyn's reign was short-lived. He died suddenly in 1014, just 5 weeks after ascending the English throne. Although his death plunged England into chaos, from which Aethelred briefly returned, Sweyn's son Canute was determined to complete his father's unfinished legacy and reclaim the throne. England would once again be a battleground between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons.
Close your eyes and imagine a Viking king building an empire not only with the sword, but also with wisdom and political skill. Canute, who entered the fight for the throne after the sudden death of his father, Sweyn, was an ambitious and ruthless warrior. He fought a fierce battle with Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside, who claimed the English throne. After defeating Edmund in 1016 and Edmund's death shortly thereafter, Canute became the sole and undisputed king of England. Canute was unlike his father. He was not only a conqueror, but also an extremely skilled statesman. He built a vast North Sea empire encompassing England, Denmark, and Norway. His vision was not merely to conquer lands, but to govern them in peace and order, establishing lasting stability. This would bring England the peace it had long lacked. To bring peace to England, Canute took wise steps. First, he established a balance between the Anglo-Saxon and Danish nobility. He married Emma, widow of Ethelred, the last heir to Wessex, the greatest Anglo-Saxon dynasty. This strategic marriage both enhanced his legitimacy and eased tensions among the nobility by attracting a powerful Anglo-Saxon queen with Norman connections to his side. Despite being a conqueror, Canute respected Anglo-Saxon customs and laws. He even declared that he would continue to uphold the laws of Edgar the Peaceful. He divided the former Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, into 4 major earls and appointed powerful rulers called ealdormans or earls. This balanced form of government maintained central authority while granting local autonomy. This administrative arrangement would form the basis of English governance for centuries. One of Canute's most significant actions was his strong relationship with the Church. To establish himself as a Christian and legitimate ruler, he made a pilgrimage to Rome and made large donations to churches and monasteries. He gained the support of the Anglo-Saxons and European Christian world. These actions helped to erase England's Viking past and place Canute on par with other European kings. Canute's reign marked an unexpected period of stability and prosperity for England. Secure sea routes revitalized trade, and even the Danegeld tax, which had been a burden for many years, was soon abolished, easing the burden on the people. History remembers him not only as a Viking warrior, but also as a wise ruler who brought law, peace, and stability to England. His reign marked the end of the Viking Age, but also deepened its cultural and political heritage, bringing two cultures together. Canute transformed England into one of the most powerful and prosperous kingdoms in Europe. Now, rest. In the wake of this great empire, we will take a look at the cultural world of the Anglo-Saxons, their art, literature, and way of life. Close your eyes and immerse yourself in the daily life beyond the Viking wars and the splendor of the kingdoms. Now we will explore the spirit and lifestyle of the Anglo-Saxons, the art they produced, and the literature they left behind. Their world was built on land, faith, and warrior honor. Anglo-Saxon life was largely based on the land and its cycle. Villages were the center of life. The vast majority of the population was engaged in farming. Houses consisted of long single-room halls, typically made of wood and thatch. These long halls were not only living spaces, but also community centers. Meals were eaten here. Lords feasted with their loyal men. Thegn. Meetings were held, and winter warmth was shared together. Family and kinship ties were very strong. Society was organized based on blood ties, and injustice done to one individual affected the entire family. This strong social structure played a critical role in resisting Viking raids and maintaining local governments, as a culture of vengeance, feud, or compensation, Wergild maintained social order. Arts and crafts were an integral part of this culture. Anglo-Saxon goldsmiths were masters of fine craftsmanship and metalwork. Gold and silver jewelry found at burial sites like Sutton Hoo are filled with intricate animal motifs and intertwined geometric patterns. These patterns combined both pagan and Christian symbols to create a unique visual language. Artworks were often used to denote the status of lords and the wealthy, and their intricate details reflect the high skill of the artisans of the period. However, the most enduring legacy of the Anglo-Saxons was their literature. With Christianization, a culture of writing and reading flourished in monasteries. Initially written in Latin, works began to be translated into Old English following King Alfred's reforms. Anglo-Saxon literature had a melancholic and epic tone. Poems recounted the hardships of life, the heroism of warriors, the loneliness of sailors, and the agony of being driven from their lands. These poems, often passed down orally and lyrically recited by scopes, both entertained the public and preserved historical memory. At the culmination of all this cultural richness stood the greatest epic in English literature. Now rest, and in the next chapter, sail into the story of that epic hero, Beowulf. Close your eyes and hear the echo of a Davidic voice transporting you to a misty, ancient Norse hall. There lies the most magnificent work of Anglo-Saxon literature, a tale of heroism and death spanning thousands of years. Beowulf. This epic poem, composed of 3,182 lines in Old English, tells the story of the Anglo-Saxons' ancestors before the Viking Age. Its setting is not in England, but in the lands of Denmark and Sweden, where the Vikings' ancestors lived. This demonstrates the Anglo-Saxons' deep respect for their own roots and for the dramatic warrior culture. Even while written in monasteries, this epic skillfully blended pagan and Christian themes. The epic consists of three major parts. In the first part, the Swedish hero Beowulf crosses the sea to defeat Grendel, the flesh-eating monster who terrorizes Heorot, the council hall of King Hrothgar of Denmark. Beowulf kills Grendel in unarmed combat because he knows the monster is invulnerable to any man-made weapon. This highlights his superior strength and courage. In the second part, he battles Grendel's vengeful mother and defeats her in her underwater lair. These battles are not merely physical struggles, but also symbolic representations of the fight against evil in the Anglo-Saxon world. In the third and most poignant part of the epic, years pass. Beowulf has aged and become king of his own people, the Geats. His kingdom is threatened by a fearsome dragon guarding his treasury. Relying on the strength of his youth, the hero confronts the dragon in the final battle of his life. He wins the battle, but suffers mortal wounds from the dragon's poisonous bite. Even in his final moments, Beowulf embodies the ideal of a noble warrior who sacrifices himself for the sake of glory and honor. Beowulf is not simply a tale of monster hunting. It reflects the fundamental values of Anglo-Saxon culture: heroism, that is, sacrificing one's life for the safety of others; allegiance, absolute loyalty to the king and lord. In return for this loyalty, the lord would give his warriors valuables; fame and glory, the desire to achieve immortality on the battlefield; and, above all, fate, weird, the acceptance of one's inevitable fate and mortality. The epic is like a mirror that unites both the Anglo-Saxon barbaric past and their Christianized present. It is an invaluable legacy, revealing how a society sees itself, what it speaks of, and what it values. Now, with the echoes of these epic words lingering in the mind, the next chapter will focus on the law and order that sustained Anglo-Saxon societies.
Close your eyes and consider how social order and justice were maintained not only by the sword, but also by written rules. The Anglo-Saxons developed a simple yet effective legal system. This system incorporated local customs, religious rules, and royal decrees, and it became increasingly systematic through the efforts of Alfred and other kings. One of the fundamental goals of Anglo-Saxon law was to prevent violence and endless blood feuds. The most fundamental pillar of this system was the wergild, man's price. This was the monetary compensation the offender had to pay to the victim's family when someone was harmed or killed. Each individual had a worth determined by their social status. The wergild varied for a slave, a farmer, or a lord. This compensation was intended to satisfy a sense of justice and restore social peace, rather than to incite blood feuds. By paying a fine, justice was achieved, and the murder was considered avenged. Law was also regulated by written laws, dooms issued by kings. Alfred the Great, in particular, standardized the law by creating a code of laws, incorporating both ancient Germanic customs and the Ten Commandments. These laws covered a wide range of subjects, from theft to property disputes, and aimed to spread the king's understanding of justice throughout the kingdom. When evidence was insufficient in a case,
Various judgment of God tests were used to determine guilt or innocence, the oath and the ordeal. Rituals such as carrying a hot iron or being thrown into water were used, for example. This demonstrates the profound influence of religious belief on the legal process, as people believed that God would protect the innocent and expose the guilty. The judicial system operated at the local level. Assemblies, moots, of administrative districts called shires and hundreds met regularly to resolve social disputes. In these assemblies, local nobles and freemen would gather, hear evidence, and render their verdicts. This was a decentralized system in which the people directly participated in government and justice. Anglo-Saxon law was a practical and flexible structure designed to maintain social order. It focused on restoring social harmony and peace rather than punishing criminals. Now, in the shadow of this order, a new influence was slowly rising that would fundamentally change England. Listen, and in the next chapter, see how the Norman influence began on the road to conquest in England. Close your eyes and travel back to a time when England's political winds blew not from the north, but from the west, off the coast of France. After the chaos left by the Vikings, a king of Anglo-Saxon descent, but Norman in spirit and upbringing, ascended the English throne. Edward the Confessor, Edward the Pious. Edward was born during the years his father, Athelred, fled the Vikings and spent his exile in Normandy. He spent his youth in the lands of Duke William, the future conqueror of England, immersed entirely in Norman culture and language. Although physically returned to England upon his accession to the throne in 1042, his heart and political preferences remained in Normandy. Edward was a pious and peaceful king, but his rule was weak and indecisive. Nostalgic for the lands of his childhood, he preferred to bring Norman friends and advisors into his court and administration rather than English nobles. Normans were installed in key positions in the church, the army, and local government. For the first time, a completely new and foreign influence was penetrating England, one that the Anglo-Saxons had no such formidable rival as the Danes. This situation led to significant tension between Edward and the powerful Anglo-Saxon nobility, particularly the House of Godwin, the powerful Earl of Wessex. Godwin and his sons represented a nationalist faction opposed to Edward's Normanization policies and sought to preserve Anglo-Saxon traditions. This tension between the king and his Norman friends and advisors and the local Anglo-Saxon aristocracy constituted the central political conflict of Edward's reign. This conflict sometimes led to the exile of the House of Godwin, but thanks to popular support, the Godwins consistently managed to return. The most enduring act of Edward's reign was the commencement of the construction of Westminster Abbey. This magnificent structure symbolized Edward's deep piety and made him the first king to establish London as the political center of Anglo-Saxon England. The abbey was completed at the end of 1065, shortly before the conquest. Edward died childless in January 1066. His childless death shattered England's political stability and created a major succession crisis. Allegations were immediately circulated. Edward was rumored to be a Norman friend and even promised the throne to William, Duke of Normandy. With Edward's death, England was about to be torn between three different claimants: Harold Godwinson, the most powerful Anglo-Saxon nobleman; William, the Norman Duke; and Harald Hardrada, the Viking king of Norway. This ushered in 1066, the most critical year in English history. Rest now, for when you awaken, I will take you into that epic year, the shadow of war and conquest, when the fate of England would be decided. Close your eyes and feel the tense atmosphere of the royal court at Westminster on that cold January day of 1066.
With the death of King Edward, the throne had become vacant, and the nobles, mindful of the country's political and military realities, cried out the name of the most powerful man of English blood, Harold Godwinson. Harold was the most prominent member of the House of Godwin, England's most powerful noble family. As Earl of Wessex, he had gained years of experience governing the country and proven his military and political prowess. His military prowess, political acumen, and the support of the Anglo-Saxon people were behind him. Rumors circulating that Edward had entrusted the throne to him on his deathbed also legitimized his accession. His accession was hasty, for the Norman threat was imminent. With the blessing of Westminster Abbey, he was crowned within mere hours. However, this crown was a royal burden that would not go unpunished. Harold's accession to the throne was immediately declared illegal by his two major rivals. First, William, Duke of Normandy. William claimed that Harold had sworn fealty to him and claimed that Edward had usurped the throne against his will. William took his claim to the English crown seriously and began preparing a large invasion force, complete with horses and ships, on the other side of the English Channel. Second, Harold Hardrada, King of Norway. He claimed the inheritance of his Viking ancestors who had conquered England and was preparing his massive ships to revive his claim to the Viking throne. While Harold was grappling with the threat of a Norman invasion, he also had to anticipate a Viking raid from the north. He decided to defend his country with an army awaiting William on the southern coast. Months of tense waiting ensued. That summer, William's winds were blowing against him, and the invasion was delayed. As Harold's army began to disintegrate after months of waiting, the real blow came from the north. King Harold Hardrada of Norway allied himself with Harold's treacherous brother, Tostig Godwinson, and launched an invasion of northern England. Within a month, Harold Godwinson would be forced to fight two major battles that would determine his country's fate. History gave him little time to prepare, and the wheels of fate began to turn rapidly. Now rest and imagine the speed and courage with which Harold marched north in September of that year.
Close your eyes and find yourself amidst that epic speed. Learning of the Viking threat from the north, King Harold Godwinson, despite the dispersion of his army awaiting the Norman invasion in the south, rallied his remaining troops and marched north at incredible speed, covering over 300 kilometers in just 4 days. This arduous march demonstrated the incredible endurance of the Anglo-Saxon army. In the final days of September 1066, the Viking army of Norwegian King Harald Hardrada and the traitor Tostig Godwinson, after plundering northern England, rested in the village of Stamford Bridge, near York, gathering their spoils. The Vikings had not anticipated the Anglo-Saxon army's rapid arrival. They had even stripped off their armor in the sweltering heat. On September 25, 1066, Harold's army launched a complete surprise attack on the Vikings. Before they even had a chance to don their armor, they were forced to battle on the other side of the bridge. The battle at Stamford Bridge began with an incredible act of heroism. Legend has it that a single Viking warrior held the bridge for hours with his axe, single-handedly holding back the Anglo-Saxon advance. This heroic act was only quelled when the Anglo-Saxons sent a soldier under the bridge in a boat and wounded him with a spear. Finally, the Anglo-Saxons crossed the bridge and a pitched battle began. The Battle of Stamford Bridge resulted in a decisive Anglo-Saxon victory, effectively ending the Viking threat to England. Harold Haralda of Norway was killed in the battle, effectively ending the Viking claim to the throne in England. Harold's brother Tostig was among those slain. This victory was a tremendous morale boost for the Anglo-Saxons. Harold Godwinson had ended the centuries-old Viking threat to England. While the joy and weariness of victory continued, Harold and his men were unaware of a new and far greater threat looming southward. Just 2 days after the battle, the worst news arrived. William, Duke of Normandy, had finally crossed the English Channel and landed with his army at Pevensey Bay on the south coast of England. Harold, exhausted by victory, was forced to race south once more with his depleted and exhausted army toward the final battle that would decide the fate of England. He had no time to rest or for reinforcements. All roads now led to a small hill called Hastings, and on this hill lay the Anglo-Saxons' last hope. Close your eyes and feel the tension of Saturday morning, October 14, 1066. King Harold Godwinson, rushing south after the victory at Stamford Bridge, faced Duke William's fresh and well-rested Norman army with his exhausted and depleted army. The battle was fought on a small hill on the south coast, Sinlac Hill, near Hastings. To conserve the strength of his weary soldiers, Harold employed a clever tactic, forming a shield wall on the summit of Sinlac Hill. This was the famous defensive formation of the Anglo-Saxons. Warriors would stand shoulder to shoulder, clasping their shields together, forming a formidable wall. With the advantage of the hilltop, this wall was virtually impassable. Harold expected William's army to be exhausted by the attack. The battle began around 9 a.m. with Norman archers. William's army, Norman infantry, Bretons, and French, attacked repeatedly throughout the day, attempting to break the shield wall that descended from the hill. The Norman horsemen struggled to break through the Anglo-Saxon infantry, and the wall held out for hours. The Anglo-Saxons inflicted heavy losses on the cavalry with their axes. To break the discipline of the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, William employed one of history's most famous military tricks, a feigned retreat. By feigning retreat, the Normans lured some of the Anglo-Saxon warriors into a trap. Some Anglo-Saxons, losing their discipline, descended the hill to pursue the Normans. When part of the shield wall fell into this trap and broke formation, the Norman cavalry quickly returned and began ruthlessly mowing down the scattered Anglo-Saxon infantry. This tactic drastically changed the course of the battle. Later in the day, Harold and his brothers held out alone. However, Harold was killed, according to legend, by an arrow in the eye or by sword thrusts from Norman knights. The king's death shattered the Anglo-Saxon resistance. By sunset, Sinlac Hill was covered in blood, and the fate of England had changed. The Normans were victorious. Hastings was not just a battle, it was the end of an era. Anglo-Saxon rule ended, and England's political structure, language, culture, and social order would be radically transformed. Now, rest, for the Norman conquest that followed this victory would rewrite England's identity forever. Close your eyes and feel the shadow of ruthless conquest that followed victory. Duke William, who defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings, was crowned King William I of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. However, his coronation did not mean the conquest of England. The real challenge of conquest was to crush the resistance and consolidate his rule. Resistance was just beginning. The Norman conquest was not completed in a single battle, but in a brutal 5-year period of occupation and oppression. William used fear and terror, as well as military force, to impose his rule on England. After Hastings, the Anglo-Saxon nobles in London attempted to crown the young Edgar Atheling, the last heir to the Anglo-Saxon royal line. William quickly crushed this resistance and returned some of the lands to the subservient nobles in exchange for their loyalty. However, the greatest and most sustained resistance came from northern England. When the Anglo-Saxons in York rebelled in 1069, William retaliated with one of the most brutal acts recorded in history, the harrowing of the North. Villages were burned, fields were salted, and livestock were slaughtered. This action led to the starvation of thousands of Anglo-Saxons, leaving the region unable to recover for decades. In this way, William completely subjugated the North and taught them a lesson they would never dare to rebel again. One of the last symbols of resistance was the legendary guerrilla leader Heptarchy the Wake, based in the Fens. He waged guerrilla warfare against the Normans, providing the last spark of the Anglo-Saxon spirit of freedom, and William made a concerted effort to defeat him. After suppressing the resistance, William seized almost all of the Anglo-Saxon lands, distributing them to Norman barons loyal to him. The English nobility was replaced by French-speaking Normans. The Anglo-Saxon church also changed hands. Norman clergy were appointed to important bishopric and archbishopric positions. This conquest transformed England's political, economic, and social structure into a new system called feudalism. William became the country's largest landowner and sole authority. England was now a Norman possession, not an Anglo-Saxon one, and William, the architect of this transformation, would forever alter the face of the country. Now, rest and see how Norman power was consolidated.
Close your eyes and feel yourself in the shadow of William the Conqueror, England's new and ruthless king at the dawn of a new era. Crowned in 1066, William not only conquered England, but also transformed it into a masterpiece of governance. His priority was to secure his kingdom after suppressing rebellions, and he did so by introducing the feudal system to England. William declared that all lands in England belonged to him after God. This was a radical change. He distributed the confiscated lands of the Anglo-Saxon nobility among 180 Norman barons loyal to him. These barons leased the land from the king and in return owed William military service and loyalty. This completely overturned the old Anglo-Saxon system, establishing a rigid hierarchy based on loyalty. He built Motte and Bailey-style wooden and earthen castles throughout the country. These castles were both concrete symbols of Norman power and served as military bases to quickly suppress rebellions. He also initiated the construction of the Tower of London, White Tower, a lasting monument to royal authority. Norman feudalism differed from that of continental Europe. William ensured that all nobles were directly subject to him. With the principle of "my vassal's vassal is my vassal," he established absolute authority over the crown and prevented powerful lords from fighting among themselves. With his military might and administrative skills, William achieved a level of centralization unprecedented in England. William's rule brought the French language, culture, and architecture to England. French was spoken at court, in government, and in law. Anglo-Saxon language and culture remained in the language of the lower classes. French was the language of the ruling class, Latin the language of religion, and Old English the language of the people. William ruled England with an iron fist until his death in 1087. The system of government he established not only shaped England's social structure, but also its legal and administrative foundations. England had ceased to be a Viking kingdom and become a Norman French kingdom. However, the most astonishing evidence of the comprehensiveness and detail of William's rule lies in a massive record he commissioned a year before his death. Now rest, for in the next chapter, we will see how William put his kingdom to paper.
Close your eyes and listen to the meticulous work of a pen recording the lives, property, and lands of hundreds of thousands of people. In 1085, at the behest of King William, an unprecedented undertaking was launched throughout England, the preparation of Domesday Book. This was the first comprehensive national census in history. Domesday literally means Domesday Book of Judgment, for just like Domesday, there was no escaping this book. What was written was indisputable. It was not simply a tax record, but concrete proof of a king's desire to completely control the conquered country. William wanted to know precisely who owned everything in England, how valuable it was, and how much tax he was obligated to pay. For 2 years, William's officials traveled throughout England, except for Durham and the north, asking the same detailed questions for every county. Who owned this land in 1066, before the conquest? Who owns it now? How many plowlands were there? How many villeins and serfs lived there? How many mills, fish ponds, and forests were there? What was the value of this land? This record was a snapshot of the transition from Anglo-Saxon to Norman England. The book allowed William to know precisely his tax revenues, military resources, and the amount of land his nobles owned. This detailed information made his centralized control of the kingdom absolute, giving William leverage over his nobles. The Domesday Book not only strengthened William's rule, but also became an invaluable treasure for modern historians. It is the most comprehensive and valuable record we have of the demographic, economic, and social structure of 11th century England. The name, population, and value of nearly every village are recorded in this book. This book was an administrative and bureaucratic triumph of the Norman Conquest. William conquered the country not only by the sword, but also by paper and ink. However, the greatest and most lasting impact of this administrative victory was to be on the language that Anglo-Saxons spoke for hundreds of years. Now rest, for in the next chapter we will see how William put his kingdom to paper.
Close your eyes and listen to how words, syllables, and sounds clashed on a battlefield. The Norman Conquest radically changed not only the administration of England, but also its spoken language, laying the foundation for modern English. Before the conquest, the Anglo-Saxons spoke Old English. This language of Germanic origin was closer in grammar and vocabulary to modern German and Scandinavian. It was the language of the people and local administration. With the Norman Conquest, Norman French came to England. The royal family, nobility, court, legal system, and upper echelons of the church spoke French. The Anglo-Saxon people, however, continued to speak Old English. The centuries-long coexistence of these two languages led to their intense influence, resulting in the emergence of a new language called Middle English. English acquired approximately 10,000 new words during this period. Most words related to administration and law come from French. Examples include judge, jury, justice, parliament, army, duke, crown. Furthermore, the names of meat animals remained Anglo-Saxon, the language of the peasant who raised them: cow, sheep, pig. But when they were slaughtered and served at the dinner table, their names became French, the language of the eating lord: beef, mutton, mouton. This reflects the difference in social status. Old English combined with the rich vocabulary of French to simplify grammatical structure. The two languages evolved towards a more flexible and analytical structure by loosening grammatical rules and word inflections. Without this merger, the language we speak today would likely be very different, much closer to Germanic languages. The Norman Conquest was a linguistic revolution. Anglo-Saxon words and Norman words combined to create modern English, one of the world's most diverse languages. The language, like English culture, has been shaped by the legacy of two different worlds. Now listen, for the story of these languages is also the story of the architectural legacy created by the merging of these two cultures.
Close your eyes and imagine those simple, strong structures where stone, wood, and faith merged. Anglo-Saxon architecture before the Norman Conquest was generally not as ornate as that of the Normans, but it possessed a unique strength and spirituality. Most structures built during the Anglo-Saxon period, especially castles and houses, were constructed of wood and therefore have not stood the test of time. Wooden structures were common due to their rapid construction and compatibility with local materials. However, thanks to the use of stone in church architecture, valuable examples survive today. These structures are tangible evidence of the Anglo-Saxons' beliefs during the Christianization process. Anglo-Saxon churches were generally recognized for the following characteristics. The body of the church, nave, was unusually long, narrow, and high. This structure also evoked a sense of defense against Viking raids. Towers were generally constructed with thick walls and simple rectangular shapes. Sometimes the tops of the towers were adorned with round arches. The use of large stone blocks placed vertically and horizontally at the corners of walls was one of the most distinctive features of Anglo-Saxon architecture. This technique strengthened the structure while also creating an aesthetic rhythm. Windows and doors sometimes had a triangular shape at the top or simple rounded arches. Unlike Romanesque architecture, Anglo-Saxon churches focused on functionality and durability, rather than ornamentation and detail. When the Normans conquered England, they either destroyed most Anglo-Saxon churches or built over them in the Norman style. The Normans considered Anglo-Saxon structures primitive. Consequently, few purely Anglo-Saxon churches survive today. However, in small-town churches like those at Earl's Barton, with its North Tower, and Bradford-on-Avon, we can still see the simple and strong spirit of the period. These structures represented the piety of the Anglo-Saxons, a firm and enduring faith even in a difficult life. Now, rest, and in the next section, focus on the art, the fine craftsmanship created by the hands of the Anglo-Saxons. Close your eyes and see how Viking swords, kings' crowns, and sacred texts became works of art. Unlike their barbarian imagery, the Anglo-Saxons were exceptionally skilled craftsmen in both religious and secular matters. Their art drew inspiration from two main sources. First, the interwoven, stylized motifs of animals and beasts derived from Scandinavian and ancient Germanic traditions. These patterns convey a sense of constant movement and complexity, and were particularly prevalent in the pre-Viking era. Second, crosses, biblical scenes, and religious figures became central to art with Christianization. The combination of these two styles created a hybrid aesthetic that makes Anglo-Saxon art unique. Anglo-Saxon art reached its peak in manuscripts. Prepared by monks in monasteries, these books adorned the biblical texts with vibrant colors and intricate patterns. Works like the Lindisfarne Gospels combined dramatic knot motifs and Celtic spirals with Christian texts, creating a visual feast. These manuscripts also recorded the Latin and Old English knowledge of the period. They were also masters of goldsmithing, metalwork. The Sutton Hoo finds attest to the mastery of Anglo-Saxon goldsmiths. Brooches, buckles, and sword hilts crafted in gold, silver, garnets, and enamels were incredibly detailed. These ornaments were not merely ornaments, but also symbols of the social status and power of lords and warriors. Large stone crosses, high crosses, were enduring monuments of Anglo-Saxon art. These crosses, decorated with reliefs depicting biblical stories and religious figures, served not only as religious but also as social meeting points. Art was a means of communication in the Anglo-Saxon world. The Norman Conquest halted the development of this art form. The Normans brought their own artistic taste, Romanesque art. Anglo-Saxon artists either disappeared or were forced to work for their new Norman masters. But the complex, powerful, and spiritual artistic legacy left by the Anglo-Saxons would remain a cornerstone of English art history. Now rest, for we have reached the end of our saga, the enduring legacy of the Anglo-Saxons. Take a deep breath and feel the end of this long, epic journey. The migration of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, begun in small boats, created an era of kingdoms, wars, faiths, and arts that lasted 600 years. The Anglo-Saxons literally gave England its name and its spirit. Their story is not one of defeat, but of a founding civilization. So what remained of the Anglo-Saxons, despite the Norman Conquest? Why do we begin the story of England with them today? While much of the vocabulary of modern English derives from Norman French, the language's fundamental structure, grammar, and most fundamental words such as mother, father, love, land, home, be, go, were inherited from Old English. Even now, you are using their language. Alfred's legal reforms, Edgar the Peaceful's centralized administration, and the administrative system consisting of shire and 100 counties were not overthrown by the Normans. They were adapted and continued. The Norman Conquest changed the system, but the administrative foundation remained Anglo-Saxon. Epics like Beowulf immortalized the Anglo-Saxon warrior spirit, piety, and melancholy aesthetic. The roots of the English underdog identity lie in Alfred's resistance to the Vikings and Harold's final war. The Norman Conquest ended the Anglo-Saxon era, but it also transformed England from an isolated island into a tightly integrated part of continental European politics. England was no longer part of the North Sea Empire, but a powerful part of French culture and feudalism. The year 1066 was not just a calendar year, it was a turning point in English history. The social order, government, and language were radically transformed. Although the Anglo-Saxons succumbed to conquest, their legacy became the silent, deep roots of the English nation. The Normans bequeathed the throne, the Anglo-Saxons the spirit and language of the land. Now the 6th century saga has ended. Rest your eyes and let this tale of ancient kingdoms, brave warriors, and wise kings bring you peace in the depths of sleep. Sleep well.